Okay, welcome back, everyone. Obviously, as you can see, we're going into week five, or rather, this is week five's notes. So yeah, I don't know what I was looking to do there. So apologies, but obviously, week five, this folder, it'll have, the usual this video, the weekly intro video, a quiz, and a discussion board. So I will tell you right now, at the time of recording, I have not read your responses to the special topics, and obviously your midterms are due Monday the 19th. So when I'm recording this, it's not that date yet, so I haven't graded them yet. So I haven't even looked at them, so don't email me until at least the Wednesday the 21st asking me about those grades. That's just a good rule of thumb. Give me some time to actually grade them. All right, so this is week five of the class of 8. Yes, we're that close to the end now. We're at the halfway point. So we're talking about policing, and so if we look at the textbook and what we've talked about so far, first 2 weeks was really just establishing terminology, important things in just the criminal justice field as a whole. And then we talked about the legal system. And so now we're talking about policing, and then we're going to get into corrections. So this is the transitionary points. So we are talking about policing now. And I just want to say the intro to this chapter has a beautiful statement that I really like, and I want to just actually read directly to you. I know it's sounds really dumb to have me read a line to you from the textbook, but I think it's worthwhile saying it. Where is it? Yeah, the Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about that. Yes. Okay. This piece right here, the second paragraph. The police are very powerful members of modern society. They have the authority to deprive members of our society of their liberty. They have a monopoly on the lawful use of force and often use that authority to make arrests and to protect life and property. Problems arise when the public perceives that this power has been abused rather than prudently and lawfully used. Perhaps the biggest issue facing law enforcement today is the public perception that law enforcement officers often abuse their authority when they decide to use force against minorities. And so I think we can agree that actually is pretty much what most people are saying when we talk about police brutality, when we kind of get into those roots. So I really wanted to look at those pieces just briefly and kind of, mention that. So, well, we might as well just talk about section 4.1. This first part, be completely honest with you, long story short, this is the history section. Chapter 4.1 is all history, and I'm not going to go over every single piece. I'm just going to hit kind of the big points. You obviously read through chapter 4.1. There will be a couple questions on the final exam relating to this, but it's one of those, it's important to know the history, maybe not the exact dates kind of thing. So like I said, I'm going to talk about some of them, but I just want to let you know that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the history because it's important to know it, but it's not the most important thing. And so just to kind of start it off, if you remember in the last couple notes that we've talked about, we've brought up that specifically in the last one, that our judicial system has its roots in Old English common law practice. And so it's one of those things we tend to forget a lot of times that, America started as an English colony. So a lot of our stuff comes rooted from English policies and procedures and words, which you'll find out in this chapter or this lecture as you listen. So we have this root in that system, but even that system itself has roots deeper in ancient history. Some of the things that our textbook brings up is the Magna Carta, the Code of Hammurabi, and the Mosaic Code. All three fairly influential big pieces, big legal documents, and early legal documents. If you're interested in the history of laws and the history of that type of policing, look into it. It's really cool to find out how far back these things go and how these rules have impacted today. I might do a small little, like, very small video, maybe like 2-3 minutes, just kind of talking about some of these ancient laws or belief systems and how they're still in our world today. I might do it, I might not. I haven't decided yet as I'm recording this lecture. And so going through that kind of history thing, in England, there was this thing, and I thought it was important to bring up this part in particular because it's related to words that we use today. And so in the earlier days of England, before it was what it is now, we had this thing called kin policing. And just for emphasis, kin, we're saying K-I-N, or, familial, like it's your kin. Kin policing is where the idea is that, we all look after each other. If one person is attacked in the village, the whole village is attacked. Much like how we go when you commit a crime, you're not just committing a crime against a single person, you're committing against society. So that kind of belief is there. But from this kin policing idea, we got this idea for a tithing system. Tithing. Yeah, every time I go to write this, I have to slow down. So the tithing system, it was this idea that a tithing was these 10 families. Excuse me while I'm writing this. So I can't write and talk when I'm focusing. So 10 families are in charge in an area to uphold the law. So they're in charge of making sure that each other, both the other families and everyone in the area, is following said rules. And when you have 10 tithings together, you have 100 because it's 10 tens. And yes, I know it seems really obvious, but so when you have 10 tithings, the 100, sorry, again, I know the awkward silences I'm writing sometimes. I try not to have too much of it. So the hundreds are formed into, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you're familiar with this term, a shire. And of course, if I am as creative as I want to be, I'd have the old Friends music from Lord of the Rings playing, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do. No, the shire is just this kind of jurisdiction area where the 10 families live. It's, if you think of the classic medieval style of ruling where you have, the king up at the top, and then below him there's lords, and how that system goes all the way down to lowly serfs. It's that kind of system where all these people live and there's a land mass and they all owe it to the king. Take history class, take ancient history, take English history. That'll give you more details on this. But reason why this is important is because the person who watched over all of these tithings, all of these 10 families in this shire was called, a shire reeve. And obviously, if you notice anything similar to this, this is where we get the term a sheriff. Yeah. Hurrah! We get our first terrible... Of course, my internet's being weird today, so apologies on that. But yes, so the person in charge of this area, the shire, is called the sheriff or the sheriff, as we now use the term. So this is your classic history on how these words came to be, as well as another one that I just love throwing out here because it's weird. The sheriff has this wonderful power of governance that they're allowed to enact. And hopefully you know what that word is as I'm writing it. I'm speaking Latin and writing is equally hard. A-T-U-S. Okay. Posse comitatus. So this concept is that the sheriff had the ability to raise all able-bodied men in the county to pursue a criminal. This is where in the old Western movies, the sheriff gathers a posse. Posse comitatus. Like, legitimately, these are things that have been around for years, and when you go, oh, that's where that comes from, it's one of those weird, history things. So hopefully this is something new for you. But yeah, so this concept, this posse comitatus, is important to note because it is legitimately what allows what at least gave the sheriff in olden times the special right above all others to essentially ask other people to join in and help take down a criminal. Because remember, back in these early days, criminal justice was mainly done by the people, by the community, not by necessarily individuals or trained individuals. So that it's a whole thing to remember. And then to keep on with our history, just to make sure we can touch on all the stuff we need. 1066 is important in English history. It's the Norman invasion of England. And at this time, this is where a change in power and structure happened. And by the end of the 13th century, there was this concept of a constable as a yearly election within each district, which is essentially a sheriff, but higher. And then by 1361, almost all English judicial systems went to the constable under justice of the peace until the Industrial Revolution came through and changed everything up once again. So just a little brief ancient history, and now for a little more modern history, and specifically U.S. modern history. So again, there's more detail in the chapter, and if you're interested in more of some of these individual pieces, I'm sure there are history classes and things that you can learn about if you're interested in one of these particular subjects, but that's not the focus of this class or this lecture. So, when it comes to the United States modern policing, many Western nations have a national police force. America does not. It's important to note, we do not have a national police force. We are a decentralized police force. Each state has its own, and then within those states, those municipalities, those local levels have their own police departments. They're not all connected to the one main complete United States criminal justice police force. That doesn't exist. We don't have that one overarching over everything. Every district has its own. So that's important to note, that that's where we differ among many other things with the criminal justice and the police force of a good portion of the world. Good examples are, if you've ever been to another country, I've been to a couple different countries, and they have a police force that is just throughout the entire nation. It is one police force. It's not, the Erie police and then there's the Mill Creek police. No, it's, you have the Garda, and the Garda is the police for the entire country. And yes, they have stations in individual places, but they're not local police. They are nationwide police. So that's an important distinction, and why I emphasize this. And so in our recent history, and I say recent with a wonderful big asterisk, 1829, because that is super recent. I'm even going to give you that date right here, 1829. And our text talks about this. And in 1829, we got an individual named Robert Peel. And this is, again, not directly U.S., but it directly affects the U.S. This is a British individual, Robert Peel, who convinced Parliament to pass the Metropolitan Police Act. And this is one of the big changes in policing itself, and it's very important. This is the shift to around-the-clock police and actual policing into preventing disorder from happening. And so it really changed the entire concept of reactive police work to proactive police work. So instead of waiting for a crime to be committed and reported and then going to investigate, you would have officers out on the streets stopping crimes from happening. And if a crime was committed while they were out there, they were already on the scene. So this was a change. But to think about before 1829, that police officers only waited for a call to come in. And remember, this is a time, before widespread use of the telephone and the automo car. And I'm making terrible jokes about how old this is. Like, this is a time where information was not instantaneous. It wasn't like today where you call 911 and they're live on the phone talking with you as they're coordinating with emergency services. This is a different time. And they waited. And so this was a big thing. And so this ended up coming up with the concept that we know today and we still use when referring to it, especially in Hollywood. But when we talk about beat cops, the police officers that, walk the streets and are seen all over, like, this is where that comes from. It comes from the concept because our person's name is Robert. A nickname for Robert is Bobby. And so British police officers are known as bobbies for this reason. And what they would do is patrol beats. And essentially a beat is just a section of the city. So let's just say this blue square is an entire city. And so maybe one beat would be this section. One beat would be this section because maybe there's not a whole lot of residency there. Let's go with this is a beat. This is a fairly small beat, even though it seems wide geographically. This is a beat. I just want to give you a decent visual, so just... Okay. And obviously I need a color here that I haven't used yet. So this is going to be just red. So obviously I'm coloring this section, but every other section where it's outlined, it's the color I'm trying to go for. But, so for poops and giggles, let's say that this is how a city was broken up. Each of those sections would be a beat, and you would have an officer patrolling that area. And so the idea is that while they are there, they're preventing crimes from happening by their presence, and they are actively, since they are monitoring that area, they are first responders whenever it comes to a crime. So that was the idea, and that was the concept. And so, yeah, this was something that didn't just shift America or British politics. This impacted the globe. This was This was global policing being impacted by this idea that we need to be proactive, not just reactive. And so that's just an important piece to talk about. And so now we get a little bit to this next part, which is a little less than great. Early policing in America was highly political. We've talked about it before. If you remember back, I think, what was it, quiz 1 or 2, where I said, you know, is the criminal justice system highly political? Yeah, it is, and it was a lot more. And so, back in the early days of American policing, government politicians are the ones that assigned officers. So it wasn't just, the sheriff, it was officers were assigned. And then the other thing was criminals and criminal organizations would pay off the police for vice crimes. And it's important to note vice crimes. And we're going to talk about later in this chapter. But when we say vice, you might have heard you might have heard the term if you watch those like police shows, but vice is really, they're victimless crimes, and I put that in air quotes. These are things like, buying drugs, alcohol during like the prohibition time. This is gambling. This is prostitution. These are the crimes that are kind of crimes, but they're more like a misdemeanor, but they're still kind of serious. It's a whole thing. But because they could pay them off, this was the era between the 1840s and the 1920s. The good old era of Hollywood with the mafia. Like, there's a reason why it's a cliche. But around this time, there was an important reform in the criminal justice system. And that reform looked at this. And I know you've seen or heard this term before. Civil service. And the idea behind civil service is that you, number one, are working for the community. But number two, that selections for roles and promotions are based on merit and testing instead of whoever you are politically engaged with. So this is the concept that you get a raise based off of what you actually do. This is the concept that you get hired for the job because you actually deserve the job. You're not a pity hire or something like that. Civil service is equal parts that and equal parts you are working for the people. All right. And so I'm going to throw out a couple other names, just kind of haphazardly, I guess. So we have Robert Peel in 1829, and we have August Vollmer in 1909 to 1932. And he was the he was the chief of police in Berkeley, California during this time. And really, his big impact on the criminal justice system is that he defined police professionalism. This was effective crime control, educated officers, and non-political public service. It was one of these people that, think about it, 1909, when we're talking about this, it wasn't until the 1920s that this started really happening. So he was doing this before it was popular and was kind of part of that. So we're talking about police professionalism. He was one of the first to develop he actually was the first to develop an academic degree program in law enforcement. So thank you, August Vollmer, for, us being able to talk about this. He was one of the first departments to use forensic science to aid investigations. One of the first departments to use automobiles. I like using the terrible Futurama joke term for it. But that's not important. It's an automobile. And he was also one of the first jurisdictions to establish a code of ethics prohibiting officers from accepting gratuities and favors. This is why, they can't accept money or gift card or anything for their service, because that is seen as bribing, and that's not okay. And that's part of the code of ethics, and that's thanks to Vollmer here. So that's an important name and an important impact. And then years later, we had O.W. Wilson, who was a student of Vollmer, who introduced the concept of scientific management in policing and how that could increase efficiency, and was a strong advocate for single officer patrols, Now, if you know anything about modern policing, and I do mean modern as in current within the last 20 years, there has been a push for officer safety. And so a lot of one person patrol is not necessarily as commonplace anymore. If it is a single officer patrol, they oftentimes have to wait for backup before engaging with a potential suspect. It's a whole thing that is all about the protection and safety of the officer. But it's important to note that, there is this push to single officer patrol to essentially cover more ground efficiently. Because the whole idea for at least Wilson, O.W. Wilson, we'll talk about why later that I need to specify the Wilson. The whole idea is that we're trying to be efficient. To make the public see this as a good thing, you need to be efficient and effective. And so that was part of it. All right. So that kind of covers the very brief overview of the history from the chapter that I wanted to talk about. Like I said, there's more details in the chapter. Please read through the chapter. Don't just listen to these lectures. I kind of hit the big notes, but there's a lot more that is equally important in the chapter. So that's history. Let's talk about some of the police functions. And so this is just kind of one of those things that I hate to admit to and bring up, but some authors do estimate that well over 50% of police calls are for social service tasks and less than 20% for crime. Why do I say I hate to say it? Well, because some authors estimate this is a fluctuating number. There has not been substantial enough studies and evidence to give us an accurate number, but it does seem like in general, the obvious answer, Hollywood, is not true. Most people can agree that a majority of police work are social service related, and a significantly smaller amount of calls are related to crime. That's the more efficient way to say it. Like I said, textbook does a good job at talking about these things, but I wanted to emphasize why the statistic is slightly problematic, just simply because we don't have good enough data or as much data as we need to be able to confidently give numbers. So that's why it's like some authors estimate. Most people will agree that a majority of the work is social service, not, crime. All right. And then a term that is directly related to this from the text is order maintenance activities. And these are the things that, we tend to see, and it's going to come back up later in the chapter and in this lecture. But these are things like traffic control, crowd control, moving prostitutes off the street. These are things that aren't really concerned with the letter of the law, so they're not really caring if it's legal or illegal. It's more to preserve the peace of the area, so, trying to maintain order, not trying to enforce order. It's an important distinction. So, one of the other things that I want to talk about in particular from section 4.2 of the chapter is this. And so the American Bar Association, the bar exam, what lawyers have to take and pass to become lawyers, the Bar Association, in a document called Standards Relating to the Urban Police Function, list 11 responsibilities of the police according to the American Bar Association. And so I am not going to write all of these on that note page because it's here in the textbook for you, and I'm simply just going to refer back to it. And so this is your chance with the video to see these things in person. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but heck, I'm going to read through all of them. So the 11 responsibilities of the police, according to the American Bar Association, is that number 1, they identify criminal offenders and criminal activity, and, when appropriate and where appropriate, to apprehend offenders and participate in subsequent court proceedings. This is the 20% of the crime. This is part of the job. But they're also one of their responsibilities is to reduce the opportunities for the commission of some crimes through preventative patrol and other measures. And so we do talk about this in this chapter. There is some data that's interesting about preventative patrol, and we will talk about it when we get there. But I want to bring it up. Aid individuals who are in danger of physical harm. That seems like an obvious thing. Protect constitutional guarantees. Facilitate the movement of people and vehicles. See what I just talked about in order maintenance. Assist those who cannot care for themselves. This seems vague at first, but this includes people that are intoxicated, minors, the elderly, mentally ill. Like, these are people that cannot, in their current state, take care of themselves. So that's part of the job. Resolve conflict, identify problems that are potentially serious law enforcement or governmental problems. So, these are both internal and external. Create and maintain a feeling of security in the community, which is an important role, because if the community doesn't trust the police, there's a problem. Promote and preserve civil order, which seems obvious, and provide other services on an emergency basis. Yes. This is where we have the whole first responder thing. And this is just a kind of statement. If you aren't familiar with 911 or the 911 call center, I do have a friend who actually works at the 911 call center, so I know a little bit about how it works, at least here in Erie County. These individuals answer your call. In Erie County, our 911 center is not run by the police. It is run by individual private citizens. And so they hear your problem, they go through training, but they listen to your call, and they put you either in communication or they send and dispatch a first responder based off of your needs. Now, in our more modern time, where pretty much not just the police are 24/7, but a good number of fire departments, whether they're volunteer or not, and hospitals with EMTs, like, there are a lot of 24-hour available first responders. But it is part of the quote-unquote police duties to be available for emergency responses. And they still do show up to some of these that may not at first register as something the police would need to respond to in a lot of people's instant thought, because it's not a crime. But they do these civil order, they do resolve conflicts, they do care for people who cannot care for themselves. Like, they are still first responders, so it's important to know that. But anyway, I just wanted to at least emphasize that here in Erie County, our 911 is not directly police. It's private citizens. Yes, it still has direct police work, but I wanted to at least bring that forward. All right. So some of the things that our chapter also talks about, I might as well, is, they have a monopoly on the use of force. The idea here is that police have the legal ability, the legal authority, that's the word, legal authority to use as much force as it seems fit for the situation. And that obviously is where we get into a gray area when it comes to use of force and excessive use of force. This paragraph right here is important to note, and I want to talk about it very briefly. And that is that there's a call, not by everyone, but there is a call for broad discretion for police officers. And if we remember, discretion is, they already have discretion. They can determine how to engage, but there's a call for a greater deal of discretion. So the way our system works right now is it's very bureaucratic. There are certain things that are in place that some people say or view as holding them back or tying their hands so they cannot actually do what they need to do. And so usually, the decision to use discretion tends to come with the seriousness of the crime and strength of evidence, but realistically, a lot of this kind of broad discretion kind of gives this notion of, well, what if we give them more freedom to make choices at their own discretion? And so I'm going to pose it here, and then I'm going to also tell you that, hint, hint, this might be part of the discussion board. Should there be broad discretion across the board for all police officers? I urge you to just think about knowing the monopoly on the use of force and officers having more discretion ability. Just something to think about. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I don't know that there is a single easy answer here, but I think it's something worth listening to. All right. And so our text then kind of shifts and talks about, these are the police functions, but let's also talk about how our system as a whole operates. And so it's important to note that because we are this disjointed group, we are not this unified one federal police system. A good portion of and a majority of our system in the U.S. is local departments. I believe the text actually gives the figure 2/3, still majority. I'm going to choose to use majority because I don't know how accurate that number is, but we can agree majority of policing here in the United States is at the local level. This is why here in Erie County, we can have things like the Erie Police, the Mill Creek Police, the Lawrence Park Police Department. Like, you have these different jurisdictions, these local departments that look over their area. They are all part of Erie County, but they are all their own separate local PDs. So, just an important distinction, again, because we live in Erie County, you should be aware of what makes us unique or how our system looks. But that is to note, and terrible segue, but we do have federal law enforcement agencies. So remember, we do have the federal policing branches, which are these kinds of things, but at the same time, it's not the unified, our nation all is this part. And that's why I kind of want to make that distinction. And so at the federal level, our text brings up several of them, and I'm going to briefly talk about them, just kind of in broad strokes. So the most famous one that everyone knows is the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That is a federal department. It is a criminal justice. It is a department that is whole goal is to protect and defend the U.S. against terrorist and foreign intelligence threats, uphold and enforce criminal laws, and provide leadership and criminal justice services. The FBI is the closest thing we have to a federal police department. It does way more than that, and there are some slight issues concerning FBI policies in the past. Just going to leave it at that. If you're interested in the FBI, let me know. Maybe we can talk a little bit about it at a later point, i.e. week 8. Another one that people tend to know is under the Department of Justice. It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. This is the person, or the group of people, I should say, that are in charge of alcohol issues. So that's, distribution and illegal creation of alcohol, or even just diversions, like illegal diversion. You take it from one place and take it somewhere else. Of alcohol and tobacco products. This is also the people that, look at how tobacco is targeting younger and younger individuals and how that's not okay. Like, this is the group that looks at that. But they're also in charge of illegal use and trafficking of firearms, protecting American communities from violent criminals and criminal organizations. This is also, and probably my favorite only because of the wording, the illegal use and storage of explosives. Yeah, it just makes you go, wait, what? Acts of arson and bombing and acts of terrorism. These all kind of fall under the ATF. Obviously, acts of terrorism also fall under the FBI, as well as another one that we're not going to be talking about here, but the Department of Homeland Security. If you're familiar with that at all, you know that that's also big on terrorism, especially since it kind of came to be after 2001. Anyway, we also have the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. They're in charge of controlled substances laws and regulations. These are the people that they have to, look over what new drug is on the market, what people are putting forward, what illegal drugs are on the street. Like, their focus is exclusively drugs, and typically it's controlled substances. There's the U.S. Marshals, which, fun fact, is the oldest federal law enforcement agency that we have. I legitimately put in my own notes to say, let's just pull up their little paragraph in here because it's way too much to just kind of throw out in notes. So the U.S. Marshals, like I said, it's really the oldest one. They've been around since nearly the beginning. So 1789, 1776 is when, good old revolution began. So, like, they've been around forever. Excuse me. They do so many different things, and it's hard to really just kind of break it down into all. So our textbook even says, among their many duties, they do more than half of all federal fugitive captures. They protect federal judiciary, operate the witness security program, the good old-fashioned witness protection. That's through the U.S. Marshals. Transport federal prisoners, conduct body searches, enforce court orders and attorney general orders, civil and criminal processes, seize property acquired by criminals. Like, they do anything that is needed. They are the switch hitter. They are the player that you can put into any position. They're the ones that they're the oldest and they've been around the longest. So they're like, hey, you need us to do this? We got you. We've been doing this for 100 years. We can do it. So the U.S. Marshals is something to respect and look at and be like, yeah, awesome. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. Like I said, this is only a small surface of what they do. If you're interested in the U.S. Marshals, please feel free to actually, go to their website because you can actually do that. You can look at all the individual, like state and federal departments and actually go, oh, hey, what are they doing? And, oh, what do they actually are entailed with? And that reminds me that I have something to pull up in a little bit. But yeah, these are all things that are important to note. And so if you're interested in any of these one particulars, they have government pages for them. Just look them up. So I'm going to throw out one that the textbook gives us, Secret Service. And I'm going to pose this question. I'm going to give you like a couple seconds pause of silence before I continue talking. But what does the Secret Service do? If your immediate response was protect the president, you're not wrong. But Secret Service does more than that. They were a part of the Department of Treasury up until March 1st of 2003, when they became part of the Department of Homeland Security. And their whole point is to safeguard the nation's financial infrastructure and payment services, among other things, and protect national leaders, visiting heads of state and government, designated sites, and national special security events. So, yes, they protect the president, but they protect visiting heads of state and heads of government. Like, they're not just the president's private group. No, Secret Service is way more than that. So I thought it was important to mention that it's more than just protecting the president. One thing that our textbook brings up, and I do want to note it's important to talk about, but also how it's different from something else. There's the Citizenship and Immigration Services, the USCIS. It is not the same as ICE, which is the Immigration and... oh gosh. I forget what the C is. It's going to come to me at some point, so apologies right now. But citizenship and immigration services and ICE are two very different things. Citizenship and immigration services is for individuals who are going through the full, lawful, legal process of becoming national. They're becoming nationalized in the United States. These are people that are going through the legal steps from immigration into America. So they deal directly with the USCIS. That's who makes sure that they become citizens, that they're following all the steps, and that they become a naturalized citizen of the United States of America. ICE is focused on the illegal immigration as well as drugs and crime and things like that that are coming in not through the lawful process that is in place. So there is a distinction. I want to make sure that that's clear. The USCIS is not ICE. They are two very different departments. Okay. And then we have the good old TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. If you've ever had to fly or anything, you're familiar with the TSA. And you might be frustrated at some of their rules, like liquids cannot be over a certain amount and all that other fun stuff. But the whole reason why is they're meant to protect travelers and interstate commerce. And let's be honest, 9/11 really did affect how we protect our travelers. So that's when we went, okay, we need to change all these things up. And so, yeah. Those are just some of the federal enforcement agencies. Like I said, I mentioned ICE. There are other ones, but these are kind of the big ones that people tend to either know or have heard of. But I do want to throw out this real quick just because of the state level argument versus the local level argument. All 50 states except for Hawaii have a state level police force. So just fun fact there. And so at the local levels, there tends to be a sheriff's office and then local PDs, and that's police departments. So the sheriff's office is usually over a whole jurisdiction, a larger area, whereas the individual local cops. So a good example, again, is Erie. Erie County does have a sheriff, and it also has its individual county departments. So there's the Erie Police Department, there's the Mill Creek Police Department. Like, you have those individual police, but they are all under the jurisdiction of our Erie County Sheriff. And that is the link that we have that I wanted to share with you. So it is under our course-specific content folder. I do have a link to the Sheriff's Office for Erie County. This pulls right up to the page. Obviously, the Sheriff's Office technically is located at the Erie County Courthouse. So if you're familiar with that, but this is their actual homepage. You can feel free to skim through all this information. There's a lot of really cool information and pieces about our local sheriff's department. But I want to bring up something in particular. Because of our unique location geographically, we have this thing about divisions. And now some sheriff's departments, as we've talked about before with policing structures, there's, depending on the size of the city and department and things like that, there's different specialized groups. Well, we do actually have that here in Erie with the sheriff's office. Really, too, I want to emphasize is the mounted posse. This is their nonprofit service. These are individuals who have horses. These are the horse officers that you see at, like weird big town events here in Erie and in the county. If you see an officer on a horse, tends to be one of the mounted posse. It's part of, they're all special deputy sheriffs through the sheriff's office. They're horses, and they have been gone through special training. So they are in charge of that, but they are emergency security, participate in secured searches, and perform other duties. But they're also, like any good police department and force, is seen in the community. So they show up, and it's one of those, oh, look at that, the horses are out. So it's important to note that we have that. If you've ever been to an Erie event with the police and the horses, you've seen them. But the other one I want to note is unique about us and our location is the scuba team. So this is a reminder that, number one, it's a volunteer team that works for the sheriff, but because of our location on Lake Erie, we have a scuba team. There are other jurisdictions in the state of Pennsylvania that would not have a scuba team because it's not seen as necessary. They would have to call in people from other places to be part of that team. But because we live right off of the lake, we do have our own scuba team as part of the sheriff's department. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a local unique piece about us, because if you're taking classes here and you're planning to go into, criminal justice in Erie County at some point, it'd be cool to know that, hey, I actually know that the our Erie County Sheriff actually has a scuba team. Yeah. Like I said, it was one of those weird little fun things that I was like, oh my gosh, I have to share this with the class. So yeah. I have no transition, so apologies. But let's talk about the Wilson's police management styles. Remember when I said I'm going to say why it's important to note the Wilsons? This is James Wilson, not O.W. Wilson from earlier. James Wilson put forward some different management styles, particularly 3 different styles that police departments kind of fall under. And just kind of very briefly, and you know what? I'm going to type these out no, I don't want it in a note. I want it in a text box. So we have the watchman. We have the legalistic, and we have the service. Like I said, I wanted to make sure that I was spelling it right, so apologies when I hesitate in reading. So the watchman style is this order maintenance that we've been talking about, where the whole point is you are out and about, you are maintaining the order, you are just really kind of responding, and you're not necessarily being directly involved. You're just kind of being there. Legalistic style is all formally conducted. This is the by the book strategy. This is the if it says so, it is so. No ifs, ands, or buts. Don't steal. You stole, you're in trouble. Not, oh, well, there was extenuating circumstance. No, it's by the book. And then service style is community service above law enforcement. This is where the department is more involved with community events and helping members of the community rather than actually, stopping crime or enforcing law. Of course, you can make arguments for all of that, but those are the 3 basic breakdowns that James Wilson puts forward. It's worth noting that, we do tend to see these, and more often than not, a blend of these in most kind of police department structures. We see the order maintenance, we see following procedures as put forward, and we also see a decent amount of community service or community activism from them. And so that's an important note to have, but it's important to also notice that, the police system and structure itself is quasi-militaristic. And you see this in the idea behind uniforms. The ranks are directly taken from military ranks. It is a top-down hierarchy with a chain of command. And so I ask you, this is an ethical question. This is just a question for thought, not something that I actually want you to write into anything, but how do we view the police? If we think about them as quasi-militaristic, how do we see them? Are they protectors? Are they warriors? Are they defenders? How do we view them when we put them as military? There's something about the wording that is important to think about. And like I said, it's an all hypothetical, ethical, philosophical question, not something for a criminal justice course, but something at least worth bringing up to make you go, you know what? That's a good question. maybe we do need to change how we view things. All right. So, currently, our system is a bureaucracy, which I always like to complain about bureaucracy and red tape. The concept of bureaucracy is that there are rules and things in place to make sure that things are done in the correct way at the correct time, and things, if they follow all things correctly, will always be efficient and correct. Bureaucracy is very much legalistic. It is by the book. It is you do this and nothing else. If I tell you you need to do this, that is what you do. You do not go above and beyond. You do not do less. Bureaucracy says you do this. That's it. And so that's why, if you remember when we talked about it briefly, the idea for a broad discretion because of bureaucracy, that's why I said there's an argument for and against giving a widespread discretion. Just a thought. All right. Take a second, take a deep breath, take a sip of water, look away from the screen. I'm not putting any notes on right now because I'm giving you a second to breathe. And now let's talk about something that needs to be talked about. And that is methods. Let's talk about police methods. And so that is a whole section, actually, of our text this time. Police methods is the entire chapter 4.3 in our book. And so, obviously, I will refer back to it at times because there's a lot to write, and I don't want to write a whole bunch on the screen. I want you to, actually listen and maybe write down what I say or what I put up on screen. So it's important to note that the research behind our decision to be more proactive than reactive and what does and doesn't work has been around for longer than when it's been implemented. So the early 1990s saw this reaction to the research to be more proactive. And I keep kind of saying the research, and we'll be talking about the research here in a minute. I promise we're getting there. It's literally the next thing in this whole list. But so the early 1990s is when they responded to the research that had already been available for 20 years, at least. So there's an issue. We'll get to that. But this reaction is where we went, okay, we really need to be more proactive because just being reactive is not helping. And we also need to change how we're being proactive. And so, as has been said before, it was said earlier in the book in like lecture 1 or 2, patrol is the backbone of the police department. These are the quote unquote beat cops. These are the people that are out patrolling. They do a majority of what is important. They're the switch players. They are the ones that do everything. They are important, and they are what is the preventative patrol officers. And so the idea in this preventative, proactive style is that the patrol officers will make circuits through specific areas, which are called beats. Again, pulling you back into beat cops from our wonderful 1829's Robert. So, Robert Peel, just reminding you once again. Usually if I say something more than 3 times, it's really, really important. Robert Peel. So, this idea that these patrol officers would go through these specific beats, they would, by doing this regularly scheduled and routine patrolling, the idea is that they would be able to reduce crime. And so the effectiveness of these patrols were judged by 3 major functions. The first is the calls for service. So if there was an increased proactive amount of patrolling, did calls for service there reduce, or were they the same, or did they go up? Number 2, deterring crime by being highly visible police presence. So did crime actually go down with police presence up? And then third was investigating suspicious circumstances. How much investigating actually happened on those beats? Obviously, if all three of those were really big or were seen as successful, then the patrol would be judged to be a good thing. Now, reason why I said that, we have some issues. The deterring crime by highly visible police presence is actually controversial because the data shows little to no impact on it. And for emphasis, I want to say data that we have shows that an increased highly visible police presence has little to no impact on crime in an area. And so, this is where I keep bringing up the research. The Kansas City Preventative Patrol experiment in the 1970s, and our book does talk about this. The idea was that they broke the entire city into 15 beats, and they broke them down into 3 groups of 5 beats each. One area of the city would be only reactive, so the police wouldn't patrol. There would be nothing but when some call gets called in, they'd go out and investigate. One would be the control group, so 5 beats would just be control, so they do what they normally did, which would have been regular patrol, occasional calling and responding, like that kind of thing. And then one group would have 4 times more visible actual officers present and patrolling the area. So, with this in mind, the results, if it worked, should have shown that in the group where only reactive policing happened, there should have been a higher rate of crime. In the control group, nothing should have changed. And in the 4 times more visible and more proactive area, there should have been less crime. The results? There was no discernible difference in actual crime or citizens' fear of crime. And this is where we have the issue of increased police presence does not deter crime. This was data that was available, conducted in the 70s and available. And we didn't really start making changes until the 90s about this. Change takes time. And it's important to note that just because something works or doesn't work doesn't mean it's completely valid or invalid. So in this case, increased presence and more frequent patrolling doesn't have a direct impact on random crime. Sure, 100% agree on that. But could it be modified to be more effective? And so that's the basis of being a scientist or anyone that wants to change the world. Look for what's wrong and try to fix it. So, while more patrol didn't directly impact the crime rate, what did eventually come from this is that a more aggressive and more directly targeted patrols do work. So the idea is that you focus on key areas and particular high volume crimes rather than just doing it for a whole area or for the whole town. It doesn't work on the broad scale because random is just that, it's random. But if you focus in on specific areas and specific points, it's effective. And so that's why I said just because it didn't work in one way doesn't mean it doesn't work at all. And so this is where our text does talk about it, and we have the proactive paradigm shift, which is where we get into problem-oriented policing. And that's what I wanted to talk about. So problem-oriented policing and community-oriented policing is this idea that you know the issue or you can identify the issue, and that's the focus. That's how you're going to do it. And so I actually have a visual. I'm going to create the visual for you because the text talks about it, but I think it's important to note. So we have what our text calls the problem analysis triangle. And so we have the 3 points of the triangle are the features of the victim. We have features of location. And then I'm going to have to move a little bit. We have our features of offender. Now, apologies as I'm doing this because this is going to get a little wonky. The concept here for the... Gosh, I'm not good at this, okay? I'm not a good artist, and so I'm doing my best with all this. But our little nexus point right here in the middle, that little thing that they're all pointing towards, the nexus point, it's the high volume crimes and what needs focus. So this idea of the problem analysis triangle is that you can take, I can shrink this down a little bit. Okay. The idea here is that if you put together for a particular crime all the features of similar and all the victims and see, you know, what things are common, look at the features of location and the features of the offender. If you put all these things together, you tend to come to a common idea of, hey, this is actually the problem. This is what we need to fix. And so this is what that model for problem-oriented policing is uses this triangle. It goes, okay, we know this crime is a problem, but how do we analyze it? Well, let's look at the victims. Let's look at the locations and look at the offenders. Are we seeing a pattern? Oh my gosh, it happens mainly in this neighborhood of the city. Now we know we can specifically patrol that one part of the city where this high volume of crime about this one thing and what exactly we need to focus on. That's the point of the problem analysis triangle. And I really think having a visual helps. That's why the text doesn't have a visual, so I wanted to draw one for you. So hopefully this helped you. If not, I'm sorry. But yeah, this is what the problem analysis triangle is talking about. You bring all these 3 pieces together. Where they meet in the middle is where you have the answer of where and what needs to be the focus. All right. So in problem-oriented policing, there's a list as well that's put here, which is an author, Goldstein, putting forward 8 major police goals. And I'm going to urge you to pay close attention to these as I read through them. And hopefully your brain starts going, wait, I've heard these before. Let's see. To prevent control conduct threatening to life and property. To aid crime victims and protect people in danger of physical harm. To protect constitutional guarantees such as the right to free speech and assembly. To facilitate the movement of people and vehicles, to assist those who cannot care for themselves, including the intoxicated, the addicted, the mentally ill, the physically disabled, the elderly, and the young, to resolve conflicts between individuals, between groups, or between citizens and their government, to identify problems that have the potential for becoming more serious for individuals, the police, or the government, and to create and maintain a feeling of security in the community. If you went, wait a second, if I go back to what the American Bar Association said, yeah, it's the same. The American Bar had 11, this has 8, but we have here is a common idea of goals under this problem-oriented policing, under this more rounded, developed policing process, what it does mean to be a police officer. Yeah, part of it is dealing with crime, but others is really, a lot of other duties that we don't tend to talk about. And so that's really what I wanted to bring forward with that particular. It's the reason I read the 11 in the first place and why I read the 8 there. So you could see, oh, hey, it's kind of the same thing. All right. And so then community-oriented policing, which comes right after that in the textbook, really this idea is that you can have a collaborative partnership between police agencies and individuals or organizations that the police agencies serve. And so obviously this can be almost any group. Typical groups that work with police departments and agencies in a community oriented policing model. You're looking at local businesses, you're looking at religious and worship spaces, you're looking at schools, neighborhoods. Particularly, this is where the Neighborhood Watch program kind of fits in with this system. It's the idea that the police aren't the only the only group responsible in a community for ensuring that crime is not being committed and laws being followed. That's not to say, every citizen should be out there stopping people from committing crimes. No, I'm not saying don't be vigilante. That's not the same thing. What I'm saying is these groups work with the police officers and with the agencies to go, okay, how do we do this? How do we have more effective policing? How do we help? And so that's, again, why I said Neighborhood Watch kind of fits in here. Specific school services, businesses participating in programs and helping, like all these things, there's a reason they work together. And it's, the idea is community oriented. We're all part of this. Goes back to that old concept of kin. We're governing by kin all together. All right. So, again, in a terrible, I don't have a transition, so I'm just going to say it. Our textbook does spend a little bit of time talking about investigations and specialized units. As we've said before, specialized units are really bigger city things. Smaller areas tend not to have a whole bunch of different departments because it's a lot of money, it's a lot of people. It's hard to do that kind of work in a small setting. So that's just one of the first things to say. Remember that, patrol officers being the backbone also means that they do a lot of work. And so without further ado, let's kind of talk about this part of the chapter. And so one thing that our text says, and I want to reemphasize because I've said it before, a lot of things that are on TV is just Hollywood. It's not actually how these things work. And so investigators doing the detective work is kind of a misnomer. Detectives don't do, or investigators and detectives in a department don't do just, all this kind of going after the bad guy kind of thing. It's, as the text says, a lot of boring paperwork. And I have a personal story related to this that will hopefully guide you in the right direction. But really, investigators and detectives take over the quote-unquote detective work that a patrol officer can't complete to get to arrest. Like, these are for cases that they weren't able to finish. It's not, oh, I did this and now it's time for the detective to come in. No, they did their best and they were at a roadblock. And so they went, okay, I need someone else to look at it. And so something important is that there are 3 major functions for an investigator to be successful. And that's number 1, they got to be able to conduct interviews of victims, witnesses, and suspects. So, things that a patrol officer does. They need to have the necessary knowledge and skills to properly conduct a crime scene. Again, things that a patrol officer does. And they also have to have the ability to develop and maintain informants. Something a patrol officer does. Reminder, patrol officer is not a dirty thing. It's what everyone goes through, and it's what it is. It's a catch-all position. Anyway, so my personal story about lots of paperwork and not like what Hollywood puts out there and what people tend to think. So, personal story about me. I worked at the casino here in Erie for 3 years. And usually when I tell people I worked at the casino, they always go, "Oh man, did you catch a card counter? What's the weirdest thing you've ever seen?" Like, they will have a million and one questions, and they think it's this most glamorous job. And I will be completely 100% honest with you. Yes, I have some crazy stories and some crazy things I've seen while working at the casino. But let me also tell you the honest side of it. It was a lot of meticulous, dumb paperwork. It was, okay, everything that happened had an incident report, and we had to file an incident report, and we had to mark down how much money was earned and how much money was put in. And like, the job itself is not glamorous. It's not, oh man, we're catching this person doing an illegal thing. No, 90% of the time it's just, is there any potential issues on the floor? Nope. All right. Is there anyone card counting? Nope. All right. Is there anything troubling going on? It's just repetitive nothingness and hoping that something interesting happens. So, this is my little story to tell you. Expectations versus reality. Be realistic. If you love crime shows and everything like that, and that's the whole reason why you want to become a police officer, please know it is not like that. It is not anything like how it's displayed on TV all the time. That's sensationalized. Even the reality cop shows, that focuses on very particular parts of it. It's not always like that. So, that's just my personal thing of, if you've always wanted to be something because of a movie or a TV show, it's fair. It's why I went into criminal justice, but at the same time, understand that your expectations need to be more realistic. Anyway, by all means, if you're ever interested in some weird casino stories, hit me up after the classes are over. When you don't have me as a professor anymore, I'd be glad to share some weird, crazy surveillance stories. All right, so as I said, and the chapter has said, and we talked about before, patrol officers do the initial investigation. And one thing that is critical, it is a critical aspect of all investigations, whether criminal or otherwise, and I say this both as someone who's worked in a surveillance department where I had to do lots of meticulous paperwork, but as someone who's also worked in record keeping for a college, meticulously keeping accurate records is the most important thing to any investigation. Let me say that one more time so that you know that I mean that this is 100% serious and this is an important thing, and this is something that could show up on a final exam. The critical aspect of any and all investigations is meticulously keeping accurate records. This is where people fail at the job. You have to keep very good records. Details of location, witness, victim, everything in an investigation is important to mark down as many details as possible. Even if you think it's really dumb and shouldn't be noted, hey, if you saw a person wearing a red t-shirt and a white baseball cap walking away from the scene hurriedly, I would argue that you should write down that they were wearing a red shirt and a white baseball hat, because that's important to note. That is a tiny detail that is very important. When I worked at the casino, anytime that we had to do a description of a person, the more description, the better. Yes, it was a lot more work. Yes, it was a lot of meticulous writing and note keeping, but it helped make sure that people who were committing crimes were caught and went through the actual process they need to. Meticulous details. Very important. All right. So now transitioning away from that little point, as I said, larger cities have the varied specialized units, but our text does talk about a couple specialized units that are common, and I just want to talk very briefly about them. Most of them are pretty obvious and straightforward, so I'm not going to talk much about it. So like traffic units, drug enforcement units, organized crime units, vice units. Again, these are victimless crimes. Those are ones that are pretty easy to understand. Like, I don't have to go over these again and again. Traffic units deal with any kind of traffic disputes, issues, violations, things like that. Drug enforcement looks directly at drugs, whether trafficking, use, etc. Vice looks at victimless crimes like selling drugs, gambling, prostitution, organized crime we've talked about before. These are the wider crimes that have deeper implications because of the group nature of it. But two that I wanted to focus on in particular that were mentioned here is internal affairs, IA, and I do want to talk very briefly about domestic violence, so I will put out a slight trigger warning when I do talk about that one. So, internal affairs, this is the ultimate question of who polices the police? Well, it's the police who police the police. And if you just said police way too many times, I'd agree with you. Internal affairs in a lot of cop drama shows are seen as the enemy because they're out to get me. Like, internal affairs, the whole idea behind this and why some, especially larger jurisdictions, have these is to make sure that officers are following the law correctly. This is where issues of police brutality and racial profiling and things like that, this goes through internal affairs to make sure they do an investigation. It is both seen as in-house, as in, someone has influence there, which is why people get a little suspicious. But the important thing to note about most, if not all, internal affairs offices are they are not directly connected to the officers that they oversee. They usually answer directly to the chief of police. They don't interact with others. So when it is time to do an investigation, it's not like, oh, hey, it's my buddy Mark who got in trouble, so I got to make sure that, I find no evidence against Mark. No. IA is meant to be a neutral as possible third party to make sure that police officers are following the proper procedures and the laws. Obviously, like I said, Hollywood has painted them as the bad guys, so there is that kind of negative stereotype, but at the same time, the bigger issue with the public perception is that internal affairs literally is internal, meaning they're dealing with it without outside influence, and that makes people nervous. All right, so slight trigger warning about domestic violence. I'm not going to talk about it in depth, but I'm going to talk about part of this and part of how certain departments engage in this in a better situation than they usually do. And so, that's my warning. And okay. So domestic violence it's a difficult subject to talk about. It is often a cyclical crime, which means that it happens multiple times. This is a very high recidivism thing. Individuals who are aggressors, the primary aggressor in domestic violence cases, will repeat. And the unfortunate reality of this, and this is more of a psychology and social work question, that if you're interested in talking about the psychology of this, I urge you to talk to Dr. Tate, our psychology professor here at EC3. But there is a cycle of abuse that the victim will also go through, and they will oftentimes go back to their abuser. This is, like I said, there's psychology behind it. This is an unfortunate reality of it. And because of that, the important thing to note is that a lot of police departments aren't properly equipped or trained to directly deal with the correct way of dealing with a domestic violence issue. And so in some departments, and especially in like larger areas where they do have a specific domestic violence unit, they will actually have social workers who are paired with a police officer to help the victim and to be able to offer the victim help, as well as to help the officer in their engagement with both the victim and the aggressor. So this is something that historically, much like, again, unfortunately another trigger, but rape and domestic violence has been some of the crimes that are I don't mean to laugh, but like the least effectively policed crimes. And it's simply because it comes down to a lot of psychological issues. And I don't mean like issues that the person had before, but there's a lot of psychology and a lot of mental health behind these two crimes. And our officers, just in general, are not getting the sufficient training in how to deal with these. And so it's important to note that in some of these larger departments, they are making those pushes towards better understanding of domestic violence. And so the last thing I'm going to say, and it's related to the arrest part, which is in the last section of the chapter, but it's also about domestic violence, so I'd like to put it right here, is that the whole goal is that the primary aggressor is the one that should and is arrested. Unfortunately, historically, that's not always been the case. And so that's kind of why, like I said, we got to get better at it. And arguably, we probably are getting better, but we're still not where we should be. All right. Boom. No longer talking about that piece. Last thing about the individual specialized units before we talk into the last section of the chapter, which is the legal environment of policing. Again, you know me, I love the legal side of it. But the last part of that chapter talked about juveniles. And again, we'll talk way more about juvenile stuff both during the last week of class and the special topics, as well as in the juvenile justice class. So again, I'm going to touch upon it briefly, but there'll be more in-depth stuff in the other class. Anyway, the juvenile system in particular is a more community-based approach. And it's because we recognize that juvenile justice as a whole is more of a community issue than it is a criminal issue. A lot of the kids who are part of the system, as we've talked about, are only in it because they're a youth, because they're under a legal age, so they have different restrictions. And so this is the idea of it needs to be more of a community-based approach rather than just a police presence. And so this is where I get to bring up my favorite example that if you are familiar with this or went through it, you know what I'm talking about. Let's bring up the DARE program. Now, yes, I am a criminal justice professor. Yes, I went through the DARE program. Yes, I know all these things, but overwhelmingly, and it's even said here, the research showed that there was no long-term impact of DARE. So, if you're not familiar with DARE, our textbook does bring it up. It was this Say No to Drugs campaign where police officers would work with schools and institutions to, talk about just say no. And they ramped it up at different levels and different age groups. And the whole idea was dare to say no. Say no to drugs. From a completely neutral standpoint, looking at the program's goals and what came out, it was a failure. DARE, instead of preventing kids or stopping kids from getting involved in drugs, ended up having either the inverse effect of leading more kids to doing drugs, or just kind of fell on empty ears. Like no one really cared to listen. And there's a lot of different sociological data and information on why it didn't work. But at the end of the day, it was an authority figure, a police officer, telling kids to say no to drugs. Like it didn't quite work. So the system itself, DARE, didn't really work, but it did work in a different way. And what I mean by that is DARE may not have worked as a program to prevent children from getting involved with drugs later in life. DARE did prove that police officers and educational institutions and even religious groups can work together in a community-focused system. Or, as we've said before in this chapter, a community-oriented policing. Yeah. DARE proved that it does work. We can collaboratively work together and develop a program. Now, it is important to note that DARE still does exist to this day. It's gone through several changes and it's trying to become effective. I'm a little jaded because I went through it, in the 90s and 2000s when it was just starting and it was kind of not good. So I'm a little jaded, but we'll see how it goes. But it's important to note that while it failed to prevent kids from doing drugs, it showed that we can have community-oriented policing. We can have people working together. So that's what I wanted to say about that. So let's talk about the legal environment of policing. And in particular, I want to look at our amendments that they bring up. And so our text talks about the 4th Amendment, 5th Amendment, 6th Amendment, and 14th Amendment. And so just real quick, okay, our text is talking about, in particular, when it comes to policing and going through the criminal justice system from arrest to, the final release, that whole process from that point. The 4th Amendment states that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The 4th Amendment, this is where the right to privacy comes from, even though it's never stated. This is where it kind of homes from. So this is the idea that you, as an individual, have the right to not be forced to have an unreasonable search or your property seized. And a warrant cannot be issued to seize your property or an illegal search without probable cause that is supported by an oath, which we'll talk about as an affidavit, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is where we go. This exact thing, this person, this place, with as much detail as possible. Remember when I said meticulous detail? Yeah, it's important here too. And so, real quick, just putting it out there because it is relevant and recent news, and it's important to bring up real examples for you to understand. The entire former President Donald Trump and the seizure of secured documents at his Mar-a-Lago location. The 4th Amendment, this is where things are kind of in a weird situation and why there are arguments on both sides for it being unreasonable and totally within reason. Because, yeah, it's his own private property that's being violated, but so, oh yeah, you can't take my private papers and my private things. But there were things that weren't necessarily private to him, and that's why it's a really, unfortunately, moral and politically and criminally justicely gray area. But it's important to note that this is where it's a good example of what's going on. The 4th Amendment, that, it has to be probable cause, and that's where we are now. 5th Amendment, this is when people like to plead the 5th. This is the idea that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against themselves, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, 2 parts. The second part, not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, means you got to have a case. You have to go through the full process of the law before they can deprive you of your life, your liberty, or your property. So this is where you deserve a fair trial. Obviously, 6th Amendment goes more into the right to a public and speedy trial, and assistance of counsel, that kind of thing. Like, that is the other part. But the 5th Amendment is where people like to, I plead the 5th, aka I'm not going to say anything. And the whole reason is because you shall not be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against yourself. This is, you're not going to self-incriminate yourself. So when you plead the 5th, That means that you are choosing not to speak to avoid accidentally incriminating yourself. Because if you do not plead the Fifth Amendment, or you can technically waive your Fifth Amendment right, and we'll talk about that very briefly, but things that you say can and will be used against you. And if you're familiar with that phrasing, you'll understand what we're going to be talking about here in a few minutes as well. Okay. And then the 14th Amendment is where it requires a state, each individual state, to observe the due process standards set forth in the federal Constitution. So 100%, it just means what we established at the very top, you got to follow it. You got to make sure that everyone's getting a fair trial, that you're not, slightly changing things. No, you're following the process. So, important to note, in procedural law, I'm using terms from our text, so it's important to know. In procedural law, if Supreme Court says something is so, it is so. So it's important to note that in this process, in the procedural law concept of our higher courts, if the Supreme Court has ruled on something, it is the ultimate answer. Now, obviously, we know time and again, just because something is yes at the top doesn't necessarily mean it can't be a maybe. So let's talk about some of the other parts of the legal environment. And that's where we get into this concept of searches and search warrants. So, yeah, I'll keep that up. It's important. So searches, the ultimate piece that comes down to it is, probable cause. And so what is probable cause when it comes to a search is kind of different. So when we talk about probable cause, we usually are talking about that a reasonable person would agree when looking at the evidence. That's probable cause. However, when dealing with a search warrant, probable cause, as seen by the independent magistrate, the impartial magistrate that's looking over this, probable cause is that a reasonable police officer would agree based off of the individual officer's evidence, acts, and things like that. So to avoid being overzealous and things like that, you're trying to look for a legitimate reason to say, yes, they are not just, chasing an imaginary idea because they want to. It's actually something there. And so, yes, probable cause gets a little wonky, especially when you also talk about consent in searches, as well as automobile searches are a weird hybrid, and we'll talk about that briefly in a minute. But when it comes to a search warrant, the idea is that, the impartial magistrate gives an affidavit or a sworn statement saying that according to the details here and everything, that yes, for sure, this is a legitimate process and you may go forward and seize this object or this person at this location, or going to this particular location to find said object and that kind of thing. And so it gives you that straightforward, exactly, very particularly worded what is going to be seen or taken or where you are going. And so that's part of the particularity requirement. Sorry, I don't know why I said requisition. But that's an important key. The particularity requirement means that just because you have probable cause doesn't mean that you get it right away. You have to be very specific on what you're looking for and where you're going. This, as well as the general rule of knock and announce versus a no-knock warrant, which we'll talk about here in a minute, this is where another fairly recent case comes up, and where we can talk about a serious issue in criminal justice that's related to this. All right. So, in general, when conducting a search and executing a search warrant, we do talk about, there are rules of criminal procedure, and for the most part, there's a general set of rules, but they're kind of Local areas have different specific things, but in general, as a general rule, pretty much these are the basic things. The basic rules dictated by the Supreme Court are all officers' evidence must be contained in an affidavit. The rules also dictate how a warrant must be executed. In general, warrant must be served during daylight hours, so you can't do it at night. And officers must identify themselves as officers and request entry into the place to be searched. This identification requirement is known as the knock and announce. So, this is important. Knock and announce is seen as the general rule for a warrant. However, there are no-knock warrants. And a no-knock warrant is issued in particular when there is a legitimate fear that announcing the presence would endanger lives or give criminals time to destroy evidence. So this is one of those where you get into trouble. And I say that because let me bring up, unfortunately, Breonna Taylor. And if you do not remember the name or you are unfamiliar with that name or case at all, number one, I'm surprised you haven't, but Breonna Taylor was a young black woman who was also an EMT, a first responder who was legitimately in bed with her boyfriend when the police issued a no-knock warrant on their house at night and broke in, as is okay with the no-knock warrant, and her boyfriend, who was there, because they asked who was it and they didn't respond, because under the no-knock warrant they don't have to say that they're police officers. They thought that they were being part of a home invasion, so the boyfriend grabbed a gun that he had legally registered to him, and when the door busted in, he shot one warning shot, which did hit an officer, but then the officers opened fired and shot and killed Breonna Taylor. Now, the whole reason they had this warrant was to catch Breonna Taylor's ex-boyfriend, who was supposedly using her location, her apartment, for his illegal drug activity. And so, yeah, the no-knock warrant ended in Breonna Taylor's life being taken, and her boyfriend was arrested and put in jail until he was released because, they went, this was not okay because he was defending himself and was unaware that it was police because they were not announced. Long story short, if you really want to look into more of this case, information on it keeps going back and forth, and it does not paint a pretty picture. Essentially, one officer claimed that they got the no-knock warrant because someone that they worked with at the post office had admitted that the drugs were being shipped through that apartment, but the department themselves were like, we never communicated with the police about this. We didn't know that there was anything involved with this, so we don't know where that came from. There's also the issue that they got the no-knock warrant with that information, whereas, if it wasn't accurate, that's not okay. And then also, the fact that the police department said that they had knocked and announced themselves as police officers, but it clearly stated beforehand that it was a no-knock warrant, which means, and I quote, they would not announce that they were police officers. So long story short, that whole case just gets worse and worse the more you look into it, but it's an important note when we talk about knock and announce versus a no-knock warrant. This is the danger with a no-knock warrant. If you're at the wrong location, if you do not have a particular list of people, remember, part of getting a warrant is that you have the particularity requirement. You are giving specifics on who, what, and where. If any of those things were wrong, then there's an issue. And so that's kind of where I said I'm bringing up this fairly recent case that really gets into the issue behind a no-knock warrant. So anyway, take it as you will. I don't really want to talk too much about it because it is unfortunately, a very sad case. And this should have never been the case. Should never have even been a problem. But here we are. All right. And then our book also does talk about searches without warrants because, yes, it is possible. Obviously, like extenuating circumstances where we have exigent circumstances, we're asking for exceptions because it's an emergency. That's all it really means is we need an emergency circumstance to bypass without a warrant. This kind of goes under similar to the no-knock consent or no-knock warrant, not consent. Sorry, that kind of thing. So, some kind of warrantless searches as well can be things like the consent search, where you don't really need a warrant because the person said go ahead. This is where things get a little weird. Sometimes people give permission without realizing that they actually gave consent. And so that's part of the reason why, as long as permission is given voluntarily, then it's not seen as a Fourth Amendment violation. Obviously, if there has been some kind of coercion or force, then yeah, there's a problem there. But yeah, I like this. A shocking amount of criminal convictions come as a result of consent searches. Yeah, we say go ahead, look through, and then you find something. So yeah, it's important to know about that. This just because it's a fun name, but it's also important to know. A hot pursuit search, obviously, if an individual is in an actual current pursuit of an offender, just because they entered a private place or like just because they went somewhere doesn't mean that the officer can't continue pursuing them. You don't just stop a pursuit because someone went into a building. You keep following them. So the idea is that during a hot pursuit search, if they lead you right back to where they've been doing their business and you happen to see some contraband like drugs and that's what you're trying to arrest them for, guess what? If you saw that while you were in pursuit of them, that is something that doesn't need a warrant to be used in court. That is oh, look at that. As I was chasing this person, we found it. So obviously there's a little bit of gray area where do you really do it in a pursuit? Yes, it has to be done while you're actually in pursuit of arresting, not in the lead up or whatever. And then I got to talk about the hybrid one, which I mentioned earlier, automobile search. It requires probable cause, but it doesn't need a court probable cause document or warrant to search through a vehicle. It's because the nature of an automobile, if you're in a car and a police officer wants to search your vehicle and they have probable cause to search your vehicle, they don't have to say, wait here, get in their car, drive, get an impartial magistrate to go, yep, you have a warrant, drive all the way back to you and issue you the warrant while they search your vehicle. Let's be honest. If an officer stopped you to search your car and you were actually doing something illegal and they had to leave to get a warrant, are you staying there until the officer comes back? No, you're driving away. So for that reason, they allow the compromise because you can run away. So it's like, no. If there is a probable cause for searching the vehicle, anything that they find while doing that is considered under probable cause. Now, obviously, just citing the driver for a traffic violation is not enough probable cause. So, you ran a red light. Okay. Not really something that can establish probable cause. Oh, your one headlight is out. Probable cause. No. We're talking like, reckless driving and endangerment and things that are bringing people's attention to you. That's going to be something that's going to lead to that. And so obviously, in the same kind of idea, preserving evidence when an officer is searching an individual, anything that is found in the direct area of the person that they have control over or on their body, that stuff can be used as well. So, again, probable cause is what you need in general. So, talking about arrests, like I said, I wanted to skip past domestic violence because we talked about it before. But I want to talk about Terry stops in particular before we get to two last things and then we're done. So we're talking about this and we're going to talk about a couple other things real quick and then we're done. So Terry stops are from 1968 case Terry versus Ohio, where, you know, a intrusion that is less than arrest requires a lesser standard of evidence. So the idea is that just stopping an individual to ask them questions, to just question them on the sidewalk, you don't need probable cause at the level that you need for a warrant. You need suspicion, but you don't need probable cause. And so Terry stops, in particular, have become more known as a stop and frisk, and so that might be the thing you know of. But it's the idea that suspicious activity, like, I mean real suspicious activity, allows an officer to stop, talk to you, ask questions, and potentially search you for, you know, whether a weapon or something. So this is, you know, you're walking back and forth in front of a building, taking pictures of a building. You can very well be stopped and frisked and, you know, find out if you're trying to case a joint, like legitimately. So stop and frisk comes from Terry stop, aka Terry versus Ohio, 1968. Just a fun little thing to throw out there. We've talked about the exclusionary rule before. This is the whole, you know, illegally obtained evidence can't be used against you. However, there are some cases where it is okay. Really, the thing that I want to add here that the textbook does as well is this is usually set before a trial by the defendant and the defendant's lawyer being like, this evidence was found during this, it was illegally obtained, so please don't use it against my client. And then the judge reviews the evidence, and if they determine that it was obtained in violation, it won't be allowed to be used. And if it is found to be that and is supposed to be not admitted in court, it also means that its existence cannot be mentioned at trial. And I bring this up because this still happens. I don't like beating a dead horse, but the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp defamation trial, Amber Heard's lawyer at a couple points did mention evidence that was not admitted into evidence for the jury to see. And so right here, they're not supposed to be mentioning it, but they did. Again, not calling out either side. Both sides have some problems, but I wanted to at least mention that this is something that has happened recently at a large televised thing, and I want to at least put forward that notion. So as I said, pleading the fifth, the whole idea of you are not self-incriminating, and I want to just, because it's unfortunate, Brown versus Mississippi, 1936. This is the first major case that prohibits torture, in particular for confessions. So, again, before civil rights, before this case, you could get a confession by any means necessary. So, officers could torture an individual. They could threaten them. They could do so many different things, and it was totally fine. But they're not fine. And as we got better with civil rights and everything, we were like, no, you can't do that. And so Brown versus Mississippi is like the first major case to say evidence that you get or any kind of confession you get from using torture is unconstitutional and does not work. So yeah. Now, this is where we have to talk about Miranda. So, if you are familiar with any kind of cop shows or dramas, or you just are interested in, the Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney will be provided for you. Like that whole thing. It's because you need, even as a criminal, you need to be able to have your rights until you are proven guilty by a jury of your peers. And so, the case is Miranda versus Arizona, 1966. Man with the last name Miranda confessed to kidnapping and rape. Please note that he had confessed to doing this. And I think we can agree, yeah, if he confessed to that, probably a big deal. Should be arrested. The problem is they obtained the confession without a lawyer being present and without advising Miranda that he actually had the right to remain silent and he had a right to an attorney. And so because of that, and because his amendment rights were violated, the court found and held that Miranda was entitled to such a warning, so his confession that he made was inadmissible in court. No matter what you feel about the case, the fact that an individual who confesses to committing crimes like this, admitting they committed the crime, and then essentially that confession being inadmissible in court, that throws out the entire concept of, a just system, at least for victims of a crime, to be like, how did that person get off just because the police officer didn't say they were allowed to do this? So that's why Miranda rights are important. That is why we have the Miranda rights. That's why officers are intended to. Now, of course, our text does mention it too, but you don't have to necessarily always give people their Miranda rights. It's a whole thing, but I want to at least give that history and that importance that, this is why it exists, is because to being able to say, yes, this is my rights, I know what I can and can't do, it's an important piece. Sorry, I was rambling there at the end. Long story short, this is what we're talking about. And yes, they do talk about police use of force and deadly force. We've talked about it before, and because of the world that we live in right now and the issues that arise from this conversation about quote unquote police brutality, which is even bolded word on the screen right now, I don't want to dive into this because I think we're familiar with it and we've talked about it before already. The use of force by a police officer has to be justified and within a reasonable use. When it is seen as being way more than required for the situation, that's when we use police brutality, and that's where we have a lot of our cases currently that the BLM movement is bringing up and not letting us forget. This is the conversation that people are having in civil rights. We're talking about police brutality, aka excessive use of force. And so there's a whole lot to this, and it's more than enough to unpack in a lecture lesson that's already this long. So all I want to say about force is, remember, they have the right to use reasonable force to apprehend a potential offender. Period. How you view reasonable is a whole different debate, and why we're currently having a debate in our society now. All right. That's like the worst ending segue I got. So I don't know what else to tell you. This was a long lecture. This was a lot about policing. We had to touch on a lot of stuff from the chapter. Again, please don't just listen to the notes. Please read through the book as well. The notes are talking about key points and supplementing on some things, as well as looking at some examples or talking about examples. So as always, make sure you're reading the chapter. Make sure you're taking notes when you're listening and reading because it does help. I promise you it does. As always, there'll be a short intro video that says the things for the week, but just want to say, hang in there. I know you're doing a lot of work, and I'm proud of all of you. And if you stuck around this long to listen to me ramble about notes, you're awesome. Keep working. I believe in you. All right. That's it. Have a wonderful day, night, weekend, afternoon. I don't know. Whatever it may be. Yeah. I'll see you all soon.